Good evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Please welcome to Orinoco Tribune, hosting author Yves Engler today for a webinar where he will be interviewed by Orinoco Tribune contributor Stephen Lala. Now, Yves Engler is an author, journalist, and activist, and is one of Canada's foremost critics of the Canadian foreign policy. And he has written 9 books on the Canadian foreign policy, including publications about Canada's role in Haiti, Canada in Africa, the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy in 2009, last year's House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's foreign policy, and the forthcoming publication, Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military, to be issued by Black Rose Books in October this year. So please welcome Yves Engler, and for an hour or so now onwards, he will be speaking on a lot of issues ranging from Canada in Canadian policies, in Venezuela, in the region in general, especially focusing on IT and other Caribbean areas. And I don't know, maybe a lot of things. So Yves, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shahli. Welcome, Yves. I want to obviously thank you for taking the time to speak with us. We have lots to talk about. I thought maybe we would try to focus, like you do in your books, on providing context to some of the things that we're going to talk about. So I was hoping first maybe you could just tell us a little. I read in one of your books a funny anecdote about a trip you took to Venezuela in, I think, 2005. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into activism and journalism, and specifically into foreign policy, and why you think that it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I got into foreign policy very much because of the 2004 coup in Haiti. I had been politically active for a bit. When I came to Montreal to go to university, I ended up being elected into the executive of the Concordia Student Union, which was a very left-wing student union at the time. There ended up being Benjamin Netanyahu, who at that point was the former Israeli prime minister, tried to speak. It had been known as the pro-Palestinian campus, and he was blocked from speaking, and there's all kinds of things that came out of that in the aftermath of that. And so I was, part of that, and then there was the Iraq War in 2003, and I was part of kind of mobilizing against that. But at that point, I still wasn't really kind of focused on Canadian foreign policy. And I had the opportunity to do a history of Haiti course early on at Concordia. So I learned a little background, and I'd read the Black Jacobins book about the Haitian Revolution when I was maybe 19. My uncle had given me that book. And so then this coup happens in 2004, and Canada's hands are all over the coup in Haiti. I'll go step backwards one moment. At the time of the coup in 2002 against Chávez, I had been to Venezuela the year before, and not really for political reasons, and I had started to learn a little bit about what was going on in Venezuela, and I actually tried to we were going to try to not allow anyone back into the Venezuelan consulate in Montreal after the coup. Sort of saying this is no longer a legitimate government, and fortunately the coup was reversed quick enough. So I was involved in like left-wing activism, involved in the mobilizations against the free trade area of the Americas and Quebec City, a big demonstration of tens of thousands. But I didn't see myself as sort of like challenging Canadian foreign policy. I still kind of believe this sort of idea, the mythology really of benevolent Canada. And then it was this coup in Haiti in 2004 where Canada's hands were all over it, and all elements of Canadian state, from the NGOs to the police to the military to the diplomats, aid agency, on, had supported this overthrow of democracy. And I then engaged in Haiti solidarity activism for a number of years. And then basically after the kind of worst of the killing subsided in Haiti, I said, well, if Canada's done this in Haiti, what's it done elsewhere? And then led me to this whole research process that published the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, a book about Canada's role in dispossession of Palestinians, and a whole series of other books. So sort of began my journey on Canadian foreign policy. And basically, the mythology is Canadians have the highest self-appraisal of their country's role in the world. I think it's declined in recent years, but over 90% of Canadians said Canadian foreign policy is like a good thing. People like Canada, even though it has had this privileged relationship to the two main empires of the past 2 centuries, the British Empire and the American Empire. The Canadian ruling class have been really close to both of those empires and have benefited from those empires and been heavily involved in those empires' wars, efforts to overthrow governments, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks. In one of your books specifically, I was reading an interesting sort of context and background to the history of Canada's role in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how, I guess, during the time of the waning of the British Empire and the rise of the American one, or US one. Maybe you can talk just a bit before we get into more current details. Maybe you can talk just a bit about that historic role in the 19th and 20th century of Canada in the region.
Well, there's different elements to it. I mean, Canada has been a major player in the Caribbean, the British-controlled Caribbean at the time of when they were colonies, and that relationship goes back to the slave trade and Canada providing cod and other things to keep the slave plantations going in the Caribbean, and then Canadian banks became major players, dominant players in a number of the former British colonies. Alongside that, there's a history of Canadian gunboat diplomacy, of supporting British interests of Canadian naval vessel close to El Salvador when there was a major peasant uprising in 1932, and the British were fearful that some of their economic interests were threatened, and Canadian naval vessel, comes to port and backs up the dictator as they kill thousands into the tens of thousands, and then one of the worst massacres where Farabundo Martí will subsequently killed. So there's a whole history of Canada being very much tied into British, and then quite seamlessly tied into U.S. domination of the region. So, for instance, when the Americans take control of Cuba, there's restrictions on U.S. banks' foreign operations. Yeah. So the U.S. occupation of Cuba turns to Canadian banks, and the Royal Bank of Canada, which is still the biggest bank in the country, I believe it was the biggest bank at that time, becomes the biggest bank in Cuba. So very much tied into American capital. Same thing in Guatemala with the United Fruit Company, and there's a prominent Canadian involved in building the railroad for that. There's a whole history of, in Brazil, the biggest company in all of South America for many, many years was Brascan, called the Canadian octopus because it had its tentacles in so many areas of Brazil's economy. And I'm talking about from like the 1910s to into the 60s. So Canadian capital played a role. Militarily, the Canadian gunboats have been there. In Guyana during World War II. Canadian. I believe maybe even during World War I, had troops stationed in Guyana. So Canada has been right there. Not at the forefront like the British or the Americans or the U.S., but has been there. And Canadian corporate interests have very much profited from a an imperial relationship, U.S. domination of the region.
Yeah, I think a lot of the implication is economic, and it's interesting to bring up the role of Canadian banks, especially in the Caribbean. I think it's something a lot of Canadians don't know about. And maybe we'll get later on into some more of the details of the economic incentives for Canadian companies. I wanted to ask you, I think yesterday you wrote an article about the Lima Group. I think a lot of Canadians aren't even aware of it, but it's probably the most egregious example of Canada's current regime change efforts in Venezuela. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the Lima Group is quickly, where it's going, and maybe you can put that in a context too, in the sense that the U.S. was apparently not a member of the Lima Group, and what the strategy might have been for the entire operation in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, the objective of the Lima Group is basically to overthrow the government of Maduro, and the strategy of it was to provide a Latin American cover for backing U.S. led policy, and the Trudeau government really, I think, it instigated the whole the Lima Group, but definitely it was Canada and Peru that began the initial discussions to set it up, and of course the name Lima Group is because the first meeting took place in Lima. From a public relations standpoint, it looks better if it's the Lima Group than if it's the Ottawa Group, or than if it's the Washington Group. So that's part of what was going on there. But Justin Trudeau got in touch with his counterpart in Peru. I think it's in April of 2017 to begin the discussion for what will ultimately turn into the Lima Group. Canadian officials were, the second meeting happened in Toronto. The Canadian officials have been part of the process, pushing the process along all the way. The first meeting after Juan Guaido self-declares himself president happens in Ottawa, and so I think that it's basically, it looks like it's collapsed. The Lima Group has collapsed. A number of countries have withdrawn, and then in the last couple of days, the new government in Peru, criticized it vehemently, very strong language. That's very, not just losing Peru, but the fact that it's called the Lima Group, that's a problem. Also, St. Lucia has also criticized it and withdrawn in recent days. From what I can tell, so this has happened, I guess it's 4 or 5 days ago now, the Peruvian foreign minister criticizing Lima Group. From what I can tell, in St. Lucia a couple of days after that, there's been no mention in the Canadian media, with the exception of the article I wrote, and now there's a recent article, I haven't actually had a chance to read it, just earlier today, from a Venezuela solidarity activist in Vancouver. But that's the only mention of what's going on with the Lima Group, even though all the media reported in February of 2019, when the Lima Group meeting that took place in Ottawa, and it was kind of on the high, the Canadian government's on the high, we're about to get rid of the dictator Maduro, and the Liberals, the Trudeau government was basically boasting about its important role in bringing regional coalition against the bad Maduro, and so lots of media attention at the time. And now when the namesake of the organization withdraws, complete silence from the Canadian media, and it's silence because this is just the latest phase of a clear failure in their bid to overthrow the government in Venezuela. I don't know where the Lima Group goes. There's probably never going to be a formal statement saying the Lima Group is no longer. I would presume that's probably never going to happen. But it's unlikely that it's going to rekindle in any level of prominence like it had maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, maybe you can just quickly, I mean, just backtrack to 2019, and I mean, what do you think has changed so much, other than, you know, we've got obviously the election of Pedro Castillo recently in Peru. What else has changed in the geopolitics of the region?
Well, yeah, I think there has been some, you know, government in new government in Mexico, in Argentina, you know, reversal of the coup in Bolivia. Some of those things have changed the dynamic. But I think part of it is just that the whole, you know, the whole Juan Guaido experiment was you know, clearly you know, a disaster. It was a total failure, and my presumption is that the U.S. and Canadian officials were sort of drinking, and maybe some, you know, the Colombian and other country officials were sort of drinking their own Kool-Aid and believing that, you know, we're on the cusp of you know, ousting the government, and that just kind of, you know, failed, and it failed because, you know, dynamics that are largely due, you know, internal dynamics within Venezuela, and that the government is not as disliked as the Western media and whatever tries to present it. There is a base. There's a base for the government, and you know, and there's also not just that, but there's also, you know, a certain amount of, I don't know, self-respect or dignity, and to say, you know, even if I'm not totally on board with everything about this government, it's not up to Washington and Ottawa and these foreign powers to come in and just, you know, make their decisions. So that I think they undervalued the anti-imperialist streak within Venezuelan society, within Venezuelan military, within, I think, even within the government. I think they thought they were going to, you know, sort of scare the government out of, you know, to make some big changes, and to, you know, give up or whatever. So and also I think there's also a kind of dishonesty about, you know, who they were backing, right? I was just before starting here, I was going back to some of the articles I'd written in kind of just after 2019, and I did a story about all of, you know, Canada's connections to Voluntad Popular, right, the political party of Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez and stuff like that, and I think that, you know, this is a political party that never won many votes, right? It was always a marginal political force, even within the opposition. It was always a marginal force. But you look at all of the different ways in which Canada is basically strengthening them, doing, you know, everything from the subtle to the not so subtle diplomatic kind of efforts to strengthen the most extremist end of the opposition in Venezuela, and I think that they weren't, you know, taken into account, or maybe they were, and it was just, you know, part of the strategy. Or these are the only people that would do their bidding like they wanted it done, but most Venezuelans don't like these people, right? They don't agree with it, right? They don't agree with the sanctions. They don't agree with, like, okay, just because this government is not perfect, therefore we're gonna destroy the whole you know, Venezuelan economy. That's, you know, the people who are calling for that within Venezuela, you know, okay, you can sort of, some like abstract level, it's, you know, this is all about politics of destroying this government we don't like, but like, how far are you willing to go? Are you willing to have a US invasion? Like, all these kind of questions of, like, you're going to destroy our whole society because you don't like this government. And that's essentially what, you know, what the people that we were and still are backing in Venezuela. And I don't think it's a surprise that most Venezuelans are not particularly excited about those political forces.
Speaking of, I mean, many questions here about that, but these political forces, the opposition, the support that they receive from Canada. You've also written about NGOs and I think particularly rights and democracy in Canada, which I think is something, again, Canadians, they might read about the National Endowment for Democracy, and they might be familiar with the US manipulation of NGOs, but I think it's much less likely that they've heard about Canada's funding of similar organizations. What has your research discovered about that?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that this is a question that was very central to understanding what happened in Haiti in 2004. So the Canada-Haiti Action Network, which is I was part of, we were campaigning against Canada's role in overthrowing the elected government in Haiti in 2004. There ended up being multiple reports, dozens and dozens of stories dealing with different elements of how the Canadian government funded NGOs in Haiti to assist in ousting, demonizing, ousting the government. And so it was a question that was on the radar, and it worked hand in hand with the National Endowment for Democracy, but particularly the International Republican Institute, which is one branch of the NED in the U.S. And in Haiti, it ended up getting, like the New York Times 2 or 3 years after the coup ended up doing like a front page article that went into a whole bunch of these details. So it ended up being confirmed by the those who are do the official confirming. This was an issue I've been aware of for a long time. Canada's role in funding opposition groups in Venezuela is nothing on the scope of Haiti, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. Partly is the fact that in Haiti you can throw around $1 million and you have a huge political effect. That the level of impoverishment is so high that
right.
that not much money can go so far in shaping and distorting the politics. There's also different political dynamics, different dynamics in Haiti versus Venezuela. But the basic general outline continues, where the Canadian government has been involved in funding different opposition groups. So one of the more controversial examples was Sumate in 2005 got $22,000. Sumate was led by Maria Machado, who was one of the people who signed the Carmona decree after the ouster of Chávez in 2002, the infamous decree there. This is somebody whose like democratic credentials are if not zero, something pretty close to zero, and yet we're funding them for like democracy promotion. So it's probably not about democracy promotion. It's probably about something else. And there's a couple of reports from 2007, a little bit later, about Canada being right there after the U.S. And sometimes Spain was viewed as number 2, and then Canada being number 3 in funding opposition groups in Venezuela. And one example that I talked about in 2010 was what you're referring to in Rights and Democracy, which is kind of Canada it no longer exists, but was Canada's equivalent to the National Endowment for Democracy, totally government funded, frames itself as about democracy and human rights and stuff like that. They gave their annual award to Provea, which frames itself as a human rights group in Venezuela. That included a $30,000 prize, a tour of Canada. They come up here and they're quoted all over the Canadian media saying, Chávez is, if not a dictator, something close to that, whatever. The Canadian government also began a process of giving a human rights award, the embassy in Caracas giving out a human rights award alongside a university department, a Venezuelan university department. And I looked at who got those awards over the years, and invariably it's groups that were hostile to the elected government. And similarly, they got tours of Canada. They got, I think it was $30,000. They got tours of Canada. I think they paid for a tour of Venezuela as well. So the group was, Canadian Embassy sponsored the officials from the group to go, do speaking engagements across the country. Ben Roswell, who was the former Canadian ambassador, who has his own history within Canadian foreign affairs as having set up the democracy promotion unit. He was pretty open about it in a Ottawa Citizen interview just after he left his position as ambassador, and he is now the head of the Canadian International Council, which is one of the most important, maybe the most important kind of foreign policy think tank network kind of thing in the country. And he was pretty open about it, that they were the central player in funding opposition. They frame it entirely as a helping citizens level their complaints against the government, and it's framed as just trying to help the functioning of democracy or functioning of human rights standards. But if it were the Russian ambassador saying that about Canada, he would have been expelled from the country, immediately, and everyone would view this as, Russian intervention in Canadian politics. The U.S. kind of had there was a breakdown of U.S. liberal U.S. politics over far less interventionist Russian role in U.S. politics. So that's part of it, and it flows. This flows from. Canada's involved. I think there is an element of democracy promotion, if you want to call it that, with their official term, taking place kind of all the time, and basically led by the U.S., but with Canada engaged as well. They want to have allies around the world, or dependents around the world, in countries around the world. They want people, getting Canadian aid money that have a certain dependence on Canada, and to influence politics in different countries. So I think that's happening at a sort of low level, kind of all around the world. But in the case of Venezuela, it flows like it did in Haiti in 2004. It flows from a very clear political objective. The objective was, we want to destroy this effort to break away from foreign domination and capitalist control, and that's where this funding of the opposition comes from.
Let's talk a little bit about that breaking away process, or delinking, or whatever you might want to call it. Someone asked me just yesterday, why are they persecuting Venezuela? Why are they doing this to them? Maybe you can talk a little bit about the economic policies of the Bolivarian revolution, and what that might mean for foreign investors in Venezuela.
Yeah, well, I think that the policies that were threatening to Canadian capital were in a direct sense, were the nationalization around the gold sector, and there were a number of Canadian mining companies that had their assets seized and were in multi-year conflicts with the government. That included being brought to the under the Canada-Venezuela Investment Treaty, and being awarded very large sums of money. Crystal X, Rusuro Resources, over $1 billion in both cases. They won a tribunal. These investment treaty things are very kind of scandalous, special rights for foreign corporations, and all all set up in very secretive ways, where done through the World Bank, where the companies are just are basically further empowered. So that was definitely angered Canadian capital, and it also Petro-Canada.
Mhm.
But it's part of its assets in Venezuela nationalized, and that led to like critical editorials in Canadian newspapers, and also Scotiabank, Bank of Nova Scotia, had began in Venezuela just before Chavez, and had all kinds of disagreements with the Bolivarian government. Was hostile to the whole project. I think that from the standpoint of Canadian capital, that a point that is really important, as important as the direct interests, Canadian capital is huge players in natural resources, particularly mining, all across the world, but particularly in the hemisphere. And so the move towards more nationalistic mining policies is very threatening to Canadian business. I mean, we're talking about like 100 billion plus in the region of Canadian mining, and this is, lots of this is quite new, right? So in go back to 1990 in Peru and Mexico, you had basically no Canadian mining companies operating. In the case of Mexico, they opened up, as part of the NAFTA process, they opened up the resource sector to foreign companies. I think some similar dynamics took place in Peru. And you basically have an explosion to the point where you go from like 0 to like 400 Canadian mining companies operating in Mexico. I'm not sure the exact number today, but Canadian companies are like 75% of all the foreign companies in Mexico. It's slightly lower percentage in Peru, but still very important role. Similarly, in Ecuador, in Colombia, there's some Canadian mining, but there's also some Canadian oil. Brazil as well. So they're very scared, basically, of the reversal of the neoliberal. I mean, usually one of the first steps in moving away from neoliberalism is the resource sector, right? We're already seeing that in Peru, where the government is talking about how we got to get a better share of the resources. Also, there's a whole ecological and community displacement element to mining. And so governments that are listen to poor people and peasants often end up shutting down these mining operations because their operations are scandalous from a human rights perspective, from the standpoint of poisoning people's drinking water and stuff like that. And so Canadian business class is the dominant player in mining globally by an incredible margin. Something like 75% of the world's mining companies are based in Canada or listed in Canadian stock exchanges. It's not usually the biggest of the mining companies. It's usually sort of the more secondary mining companies, but still a number of the big ones are Canadian too. So the Canadian government's foreign policy is incredibly oriented around the interests of mining companies, and they don't like the nationalistic policies. I've quoted this a number of places, but in 2007, Peter Monk, who was the head of Barrack Gold mining company, he died, but he was maybe one of the most important shapers of Canadian foreign policy. He actually set up the most important academic foreign policy department at the University of Toronto, the Munk School of Global Affairs, at the most important university in the country, the media hub, right, downtown Toronto, and he organizes the Munk debates and all kinds of different things. But he wrote this letter to the Financial Times in response to a Financial Times editorial that was very critical of Chávez. But Peter Munk basically said, you're being way too soft on Chávez. We know that, Hitler, and he links Chávez to Hitler, to Pol Pot, to all the baddies he could think of in the world. Chávez was, he was one of them. And so that, I think, and he also said, he made clear he didn't have any operations. Barrack Gold, his company, didn't have any operations in Venezuela, but he made it really clear that he's like, what was going on in Venezuela and Bolivia? He says something to the effect, I prefer to be operating in the west of Pakistan, where
Right.
Taliban was. So basically, he's saying, like, we have to crush. Basically, what he was saying, we have to crush these efforts to break, to pursue a more nationalistic mineral policy, not because I have my own operations in that country, but because this could affect the operations of my company in a whole bunch of other places if this sort of this process spirals.
Yeah, I read a report from 2016 that was saying that Barrack Gold had signed some type of deal, but then it seemed that it fell through or never happened. Do you know anything about any details of that Barrack deal in Venezuela?
I don't. I didn't know that there was even an effort at that.
I'm not sure of the details. Regarding Crystal X, you've probably maybe been seeing the news, and it's kind of complicated, but if I understand correctly, the courts believe that they have seized the assets of Citgo, the Venezuelan US subsidiary of PDVSA, and they want to take $1 billion of Citgo assets and give it to Crystal X for compensation for, I guess, the loss of their mining interests in Imataca. Maybe you can explain what you know about the Crystal X case and how these kind of, I guess, their bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, how these work to protect foreign investments in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, Crystal X's dispute went on. I mean, it's still going on. I'm guessing it's now 15 years, because I believe that began before the nationalization in 2011. I believe that begins in the 2006, 2005, 2007 kind of area, kind of range. But yeah, so they were in conflict with the government. I don't remember all the details of that conflict, but my understanding was that it was primarily around the government wanting more benefits from the mining. I know that there's also some ecological questions, and I think indigenous rights questions in the background as well. But yeah, and so Crystal X, as the conflicts grew, they took Venezuela through the Canada-Venezuela FIPA, or bilateral investment agreement, foreign investment promotion and protection agreement is what the government calls them now. Took Venezuela to the court, which is in the basically through the World Bank, and won. And that's when you talk about getting the assets of Citgo, that's because that's that ruling that they have against the Venezuelan government. The courts have said the way they can get that the payment for that ruling is by getting Citgo assets in the U.S. And my understanding, I'm not clear on all the details here, but there's something that the Guaido regime or whatever, they did some stuff with regards to Citgo that basically effectively helped Crystal X go at Citgo, because previously there was more of a step removed, I guess, in the board structure between the Venezuelan government and Citgo or something like that. I don't remember all the details on that, but I know that was something that it wasn't clear if that was like a really dumb move by the Guaido crowd, or if it was a conscious decision to basically lose the public asset. But Crystal X is that's like a 15-year long dispute that's been in the pages of Canada's business press for like 15 years. So it's like a constant stream of kind of critical stories of the Venezuelan government, and undoubtedly a contributing factor to hostility from Canadian corporations towards the Venezuelan government.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reading what you wrote about FIPAs and BITs or BITs in I think particularly in your book Canada in Africa. It was I think a lot of people don't. I know I didn't have a full understanding of how difficult it is for a particular government, let's say, to pivot away from the policy of the previous government, let's say. I read in Venezuela in 1997, the Caldera government, I think they gave away half of this massive area of the Imataca Forest Reserve to mining companies, for example. And so obviously they signed a bunch of agreements, and makes it really difficult for the next government to come along and just change things and decide, that they want to hold on to a larger share of the profits themselves. Maybe you can just really give a basic idea.
And also is that in these bilateral investment agreements, they're locked in, right?
Exactly.
They vary depending on the agreement, but often for like 15 years. So if a new government says, hey, we don't like this model, we don't believe that we should give new powers to foreign corporations, so what, right? It's going to take 15 years till it's no longer applicable. So the companies still have the ability to pursue them in these tribunals. And I should say that this is one of the things that Canadian government, one of the most important ways in which the Canadian government is consciously backing Canadian mining companies around the world. Most clearly in Africa, where there's Canadian mining companies are demanding these FIPA agreements with the different African governments, and they're happening in a situation where there's no Burkina Faso. There's basically no investment from Burkina Faso companies in Canada, whereas there's billions of dollars of Canadian mining investment in Burkina Faso. So it's entirely to the benefit of Canadian capital. There's no impact on Canadian sort of regulatory impact. That's not the case with some other, bilateral investment treaties with the U.S. or with China or other ones that the Canadian government has signed. But in the Canadian media sphere, there's a certain amount of criticism, a certain amount of, unions and other kind of organizations that criticize the bilateral investment treaties with the U.S. or with China or other places that have investment in Canada, because it affects the regulatory and legislation within Canada. But there's basically complete silence about Canada signing FIPA with the government of Burkina Faso or elsewhere, where it's really all about entrenching the strength, the power of Canadian mining companies across the global south.
Yeah, I mean, again, to anyone listening, I would just recommend reading Yves' book, books on that subject, Canada and Africa, and also Canada and Haiti for more details. I learned so much from those books. Let's talk maybe a little bit about Haiti, which is something you've written a lot about. Obviously, it's been in the news lately as the president turned dictator, I guess you could call him, was assassinated. Maybe before we get into the details of that and how that might affect Venezuela, you can maybe tell us just a little bit about the relationship between Haiti and Venezuela historically, and also recently in terms of the earthquake and Petrocaribe and these types of relations that the two countries have had.
Yeah, well, the Haitians, after winning the successful slave revolt and establishing a country in 1804, they provided support to Bolivar and other the independence struggle in Venezuela. They provided all kinds of I think a printing press and maybe some ships, and I believe even the Venezuelan flag was drawn up partly at port in I don't know if it was in Port-au-Prince or Cap-Haïtien or so there's this sort of debt that I think that Chávez and elements of the Bolivarian government felt towards Haiti. Haiti, of course, has always been it was punished viciously for its successful slave revolt, and it's moving the yardstick forward on human rights, on all people being equal, decades and decades before those ideas found traction in North America or Europe, with slavery and other forms of subjugation. And one of the things, I mean, there was the after the 2004 coup, 2 years a coup government, and they blocked the Famille Lavalas from participating. The political party of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the ousted president, and the party that had won 70% of all the positions, mayors, senators, etc., in the 2000 elections, and thousands of these officials were all overthrown in 2004 by the US, France, and Canada. But then they blocked Famille Lavalas from participating in the subsequent elections, and René Préval, who had been associated with Aristide, had been a previous president, sort of a mild social democratic. I mean, Aristide is pretty mild in his social democracy, but maybe Préval was one step more mild. But wanting to break out of U.S., French, Canadian domination, and just quite frankly, just the simple dollars. They joined Petrocaribe, the subsidized oil program. Chavez visited Haiti in I think it was early 2007. Might have been even one of the first heads of state to visit after Préval won the election. There's actually video of it. It's pretty crazy. There's like thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Haitians who greet him when he comes from the airport in Port-au-Prince, and it's clear there's just this level of Haiti had just been, and it was still under UN occupation, which was not just the US, France, and Canada, which were the ones who began it, but Brazil and Argentina. Lula's government they were in charge of the occupation force, the MINUSMA, and so really there were two countries that didn't join in on the onslaught against democracy and in Haiti, and that was Cuba and Venezuela. So there was, I think, a lot of respect for Chávez in Haiti for that, and so the Petrocaribe program, something that the Americans very hostile, right, to Preval for pursuing, and we have the this documented on that with the WikiLeaks and stuff like that. The program provides subsidized oil, and then the government gets to pay back later on at a very low interest rate and way down the future, and basically Preval, in an incredibly difficult situation because he's got foreign occupation force and whatever, very, very difficult situation to break free from that grip. But then the earthquake happens in Haiti and the place gets completely further destroyed, and the US and Canada use that Preval was too much, that little independence of Preval was too much even for, and the earthquake has further weakened the Haitian government, and they use that to basically put in place this Michel Martelly, who's a former Duvalier, Macoute, who's just a total, he's a singer that was, likes to piss on people when he was on stage, when he was singing, like a really just not like, just a, total like, drug runner, criminal kind of element. And Hillary Clinton and the Canadian government put him in place in Haiti, and he does, of course, what would be to expected. Even during Preval, I think there's a large amount of corruption, right? The structure, the state structure in Haiti is such that that's how things are going to happen. But we really put in like the most kind of criminal element of Haitian society, and they steal the money essentially. They steal the Petrocaribe funds, and then that really blows up in 2018 when the Americans are beginning. The sanctions are getting more and more vicious on Venezuela, and they block the Petrocaribe oil from Venezuela to Haiti, and then at the same time, basically the Haitian government of Jovenel Moïse, who's just the person that Michel Martelly put in place. There's a IMF structural adjustment. They try to drastically increase the price of oil, which is not just for cars, but it's for cooking, mostly for cooking, right? So it's
right.
The poorest people, right? And there's a massive uprising in 2018. They do force the government to back down on that, and then that just unleashes a whole spiral of protests that play out over more than 2 years, including a general strike at the end of 2019 or in the fall of 2019 that is almost a month. Port-au-Prince is like paralyzed for a month. These are, just on a little aside, these are far and away the biggest protests taking place anywhere in the world, right? We heard a lot about Hong Kong. We heard a bit about Algeria, a little bit about Chile, Ecuador, but the protests in Haiti this period are far and away the biggest. But they receive the least amount of attention because they are the most anti-imperialist, and so that's Jovenel Moïse, somebody who his constitutional legitimacy was always very, very weak, and he would have been ousted for sure. He never would have been in place, but he definitely would have been ousted if it wasn't for U.S. and Canadian backing, and so I'll maybe leave it there, but obviously people know what's happened to him subsequently. But yeah, that's some of the history between Venezuela and Haiti.
Maybe we can. Sorry, you're you have to take a. You're right.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we can close up in a minute or two, but maybe you can conjecture just a little bit. I know a lot of people are confused about the ramifications of the assassination of Moïse. They don't understand maybe clearly if he's supposed to be a good guy or a bad guy or whatnot. And now that it's becoming clear, that a lot of people are reading up and realizing that he had made himself was ruling by decree and was a dictator and so on. We've read that the mercenaries that killed him were Colombian ex-military. We've read from Venezuela that supposedly there was an assassination attempt planned for Maduro's life just a couple of days before the killing of Moise. And then meanwhile, we had the protests or demonstrations in Cuba that were covered by all the media outlets. If you could conjecture, what do you think is going on? What is the strategy behind these actions? How are they coordinated? And what might Canada's role be in any of this?
Yeah, I think it's unhelpful to connect. The connection that exists is that Colombia has been, killing peasants and targeting left wing, and they have a whole force. They have a military of people who are mostly pretty poor that do their military service. They're quite skilled at killing people, but they don't have many other opportunities. And so Colombia has become a place of exporting, hired, guns for hire. The Moise's assassination is basically almost certainly a factional within the PHTK political party, which is, like I mentioned, basically the former Duvalier, the 30-year dictatorship, the Tonton Macoute, people who were involved in kidnapping, drug running, and his whole security force just let them walk in and kill him. I mean, no one else got a scratch. So it was done by a faction. It was clearly an important faction within the government and the ruling political party, and financed by wealthy Haitian faction of Haitian oligarchy that had gotten angry at Moise, not based upon some profound, not because he had turned socialistic or anything, but because the money in the country had dried. And part of what happened with Petrocaribe is the money, all these different elements of the bourgeois, 12 families in Haiti that look a lot more like me from their skin tone than they do 99% of Haitians. They were getting chunks of the Petrocaribe money, and that sort of dried up, and that led to more and more led to sort of disintegration and conflict and so what the assassination is. This is not it's not a good thing. I don't think it's it's not that bad of a thing either. But it reflects the disintegration of Haitian political life and kidnapping and violence and the state structure. That's what. Basically, it's the extension of two things that we did. One hand, we destroyed the most popular political party in Haitian history. Famille Lavalas won the election at a landslide that almost no political party has ever done anywhere in the world, in elections that were entirely free. The right wing had all the media, they had the money, they had American backing, whatever, right? That 2004 coup was about destroying this first time in Haitian history political party. That this is not like mild social democracy. Things that all tout le monde c'est monde, all people are people. Minimal efforts to invest in education, to set up a second medical school, right? One of the things they did when they invaded, Aristide set up a second medical school in the country. That it was Cubans that were training Haitians, and when they invaded in 2004, the UN took it over and just disbanded the medical school, right? And all the students who were halfway through their programs had to go to Cuba to finish off their programs. Like in a Haitian context, they did a lot, right? Like Préval and their state governments, they built more schools in the 10 years than all Haitian governments in the previous 180, 190 years. But still, we're talking about mild, a little bit of tax paid by the rich people. This is not, not revolutionary stuff, but they Haiti is so low in the pecking order, and the rich have so much power that these small steps are just viewed as just too much. Hey, these people at the bottom of the hill are saying that they're human beings like us too. That's outrageous, and we need to crush this thing. And that's essentially what we did. So on one hand, we crushed the most popular political party, and then on the other hand, and partly facilitated by this terrible earthquake, we put in place the most regressive elements of Haitian political life, and lo and behold, 10 years later, politics and much of Haitian life just sort of disintegrated to the point of the president being assassinated in his home in the middle of the night, and nobody, no security doing anything. And so I don't think that, I think that there's real questions about what the American elements of, what did the CIA know? I don't think the CIA was driving this. If the US, if Washington wanted to get rid of Jovenel Moise, there was easier ways of getting rid of Jovenel Moise. If they would have told him, okay, it's time to go, Jovenel Moise is gone. I mean, his limited constitutional legitimacy had completely ended on February 7th. And he was only still there because he had the backing of Washington and Ottawa. So my reading of it is that it's very well possible that some branch of the American government, was aware this was coming and decided, we don't really care if he's assassinated. He's become a bit of a liability in the sense that he's so unpopular, and the PHTK party, there's just no way to imagine them winning anything, like any election or anything with this guy. So in that sense, him disappearing has a usefulness to it. But most likely this is just this is a faction of the PHTK who aren't happy with him, and the whole politics have just disintegrated to mafiosos running things, and they killed him. And so the Colombia connection is not explained by like some the right wing in Miami, the Colombia or in Miami, but rather that those places just have become kind of hubs of violent mercenary type kind of forces.
And no doubt Canada would have the same plans for Venezuela if their version of democracy was able to take root there. Maybe we could just close really quickly with one question, a final question, I promise, about Canada's supposed upcoming election now. They're starting to report that September 20th is supposed to be a snap election. Maybe you could just tell us what you think Canadians can do to make a difference in the foreign policies of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think the election is not. It's a moment. There's some foreign policy issues. I think you can kind of make it cost the government a little bit. I think that the things like the selling light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia is an issue that could has sort of hit a certain level of consciousness among the public, and can actually hurt the Liberals in a couple kind of hurts their brand and in a couple of ridings. I think that the Lima Group stuff has the potential. I mean, I think the NDP, if something was well organized and there was some occupying of some MPs' offices or something like that, and I think I could see the NDP coming out and criticizing Trudeau for the Lima Group and some of his Venezuela policy. But mostly, unfortunately, the foreign policy issues are not going to be receive much attention, with the exception, I guess, of climate change, which is should be viewed as a foreign policy issue. It's not usually, but it should be viewed as that. but I think that the broader thing is we do need to organize around foreign policy, not at a time of election, but we need to be building up the critical media, like the Orinoco Tribune and many other media outlets that are willing to challenge power on international issues. And that's the thing, like you can now read in the Globe and Mail, the major national paper, you can now read stuff that talks about, Canada having been involved in that Canada's based upon genocide, right? And Indigenous people were dispossessed, and the objective of the Canadian state was to either physically drive them out or, completely destroy their culture and to just absorb them into the body politic. You can read that in the Globe and Mail. That's partly because of decades and decades of political struggle. But you can't read in the Globe and Mail that Canadian foreign policy is just about serving corporate interests and empire. That's basically never appears on the pages of the paper. And so the foreign policy area is where the sort of mythology is the greatest, where the parameters of debate are most narrow. And so how do we break outside of that? First and foremost, as I mentioned, is to have media that are willing to describe foreign policy correctly, a reality-based assessment of Canadian foreign policy. But also, what is that about? That's also about building up international solidarity groups, and there is, there's Venezuela solidarity activism in this country. We need a lot more of it, of course. There's Haiti solidarity activism. There's mining injustice solidarity groups doing good work, anti-war groups. We need to build up all that campaigning. I'm involved in, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which is an effort to sort of mainstream a lot of that activism, the grassroots solidarity, anti-war activism. We've been around for a little over a year. We began with the campaign against Canada's bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Venezuela was part of the issues that we were criticizing Trudeau, and basically saying they didn't deserve a seat on the Security Council because of their terrible foreign policy. I think Venezuela actually, after Palestine, it was the issue that probably had the most impact he says, as a direct issue, because Venezuelan officials actually campaigned against Canada, the only officials that really publicly campaigned against Canada. And so, so Canadian Foreign Policy Institute is designed to try to, it's a very establishment-y name. The media people sometimes get it confused. Is it the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, which is a arms industry funded one, or is it Canadian Foreign Policy? They get themselves a little confused. So I think that's a strategic positive. But yeah, so trying to and also to mainstream some of this critical foreign policy discussion, but also to connect the dots between the different groups and issues that are working on these different on foreign policy related stuff, and to say, we are marginal. Let's not be in denial about that, but we're not quite as marginal as we might think we are sometimes, certainly as the media tries to present it. There are actually dozens, hundreds even, of small groups across the country of people who are almost all volunteer, who are picking at some element of unjust Canadian foreign policy. And so the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute tries to sort of bring together, it's very difficult to do, but try to bring together, what some of those groups are saying, and hopefully over time connect more and more of those groups together, and to have a critical, I would say personally, anti-imperialist network of foreign policy activism organizations. And so yeah, that to me, it's not just like, hey, how do we get foreign policy into the election? And I think, the issue, if I were to focus on an issue that, I think the arms sales to Saudi Arabia could get into the election, or probably will get into election, and should be pushed on. I think maybe we could, if people organize well enough, you can maybe get something like Venezuela and the Lima Group into election. But there's a bunch of issues like Haiti. You're not going to really, it's not going to, at a national level, it's not going to get into the media or the election. But it doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of in a medium and long term building the consciousness and the power on some of these issues that can fundamentally transform Canadian foreign policy.
Thanks so much for that, Yves. We're well over the time already that I promised you I would end at, so I'm gonna let you go. I'll stop the stream and say bye to you in private. Before we go, I just wanted to also recommend to people to check out Yves' website at yvesengler.com, where he posts articles very frequently, and some other Canadian media outlets in addition to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute that Yves writes for include Canadian Dimension and the Canada Files, who just, I think yesterday or today, published a lengthy article about the Lima Group by Nino Paglicia. So I would also recommend all of Yves' books to anyone. And again, I wanted to mention that your next one is coming out, I guess, in a couple of months. And it's called Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. So I will be looking forward to that very much. Thank you everyone for tuning in, by the way. And Yves, there's so many things I wanted to get to that we did not have a time to get to, unfortunately. So I guess I could only say thanks a lot, and hopefully we can do this again some other time in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.